Okay, hello. My name is Kelly Folsom. So my panel, and also you can go to, I have a video all on materials, and you can go and watch that about the paints that I use, the brushes. You want to have good materials to work with. A lot of the problems that I see people struggling with can simply be solved by having a good assortment of materials. So these are well used brushes, but they really hold up over time and keep their shape and have a really nice flexibility to them. So you want to find what brushes work best for you, and it is worth it to spend a little bit more money. Same thing with pigment. You'll see that my palette, I don't put out a ton of paint. One reason is because my pigment is, most of my paints are from Old Holland or Vasari, and the pigment is very strong. So I actually I don't go through quite as much paint as I used to, especially as a student. But again, if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. But always, I think, get the best materials that you can afford. Now I have toned my panel here just with raw umber and oil earlier. It is dry to the touch now, and it's in a value that's not too dark, and it's also killed that white. It's really difficult to judge color as well as value against a stark white canvas, at least for me. So I always encourage people to tone their canvas, but you also don't want to go too dark, because anything that goes on top of that is going to dry darker. It's going to have that underneath layer influencing it. So the other aspect of toning the canvas is that it just further seals the absorbency of the canvas. The more absorbent your surface is, the more that paint is not going to want to just sit on top of the surface, and it's actually going to dry quite a bit darker and duller. It's really going to suck the oil out of the paint. So I either like to paint on panel or linen. So both of which have a little bit smoother texture, a finer tooth linen. So anyway, so that's just some technical material stuff. In the first video that I'm doing, I'm painting one of my all-time favorite. I do lots of paintings on basically variations on this same theme. So I have this beautiful, brass bucket coming out of the shadows over here on the left. And I'm just being really loose right now, just kind of getting warmed up and comfortable with the paint. I'm just using burnt umber and ultramarine blue with my medium, which is the Merige. I also like the Liquin products, especially Liquin Impasto. I really like that a lot better. A lot better than the, even the Liquin, especially the Liquin Original. But anyway, so there's a variety of mediums that you can use. And the purpose of the medium is just to make the paint, go a little bit further. It makes it a little bit more transparent. So in oil painting, we are working from transparent to opaque, as well as dark to light. So we don't really want to put down a lot of heavy opaque paint just yet. Opaque meaning it covers the surface, covers the actual surface, and reflects light back to your eye. So transparent paint recedes to the eye, so I start the painting off with that until I know when and where I'm ready for some more buildup and more coverage. And so you can look at the back of your tubes whenever you purchase a tube of paint, if you're in question as to whether or not a particular pigment is transparent or not. So burnt umber, most of the umbers, as well as the darker colors like black and the blues and crimson. And then of course you also have colors like Indian yellow, lighter tones that are totally transparent colors. So I'm just treating this really loosely. I don't want to get too decisive or pinned down yet. I'm just kind of massing in my shadowy tone back here. The inside, you want to go for as simple of shapes as you can possibly get. So the inside of this bucket is all in shadow, and I'm not even going to worry yet about drawing that ellipse. It just, because part of the reason is, I'm just not really warmed up enough to even do something that refined or detailed. And we have this cloth coming off here, so just some idea of the angle of the cloth. Now I've spent a great deal of time with my setup and really thinking visually as I'm setting it up as to, how, really kind of planning it out in my head before I actually paint. Just, what shapes, how big shapes are, how they relate to each other, what the whole idea of the painting is going to be. And I really just try to envision these light shapes and dark shapes on the canvas. Now you can actually do preliminary studies. That's just fine too. You can do, no tan sketches, black and white sketches in any medium that you feel comfortable in. So if you want to do an oil sketch, you could do value sketches, you could do color sketches. So at this point, I generally just dive right in, unless it's maybe a piece that I'm just not feeling that sure about the composition, or I feel like something may be wrong with the setup or the composition. Then I might start doing some sketches to try to isolate what the problem is and kind of play around with the design. So anything like this, this is a purposeful line, setting in the tabletop edge, where that's going to be, how much open air space on the top of the canvas am I going to have versus the bottom of the canvas. These are all things that I'm thinking about. Generally speaking, we typically always want to look more in this area. You've probably heard a lot about the rule of thirds, where if you divide your canvas up into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, usually on the corner points like here, just kind of approximating that. That's usually where your, points of visual interest are in the painting. Then we have these oranges, sort of this little row of oranges coming out, and the final orange over here on the end of the painting. With our sort of the object that's going to have the most light, and I think I'm going to scooch that over maybe a little bit, kind of wipe that off. So with this approach, you can, really, you can scrub out the whole canvas and start over if you feel like things are just not placed correctly. I mean, even the shadow plane of this little sake vase, it has some ins and outs to it. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. Mostly I'm just trying to look, okay, the height and width, the simplest shape, just like a tall rectangle. These oranges, here where they're stacked form sort of a triangle shape, and then we get another one coming out. To me, oranges are not, these round objects are not circles, So I want to make sure that I'm thinking about them in terms really more of cubes, hexagons, these sorts of things, geometric shapes that have plane changes rather than too spherical. That way I'm really paying attention to, which planes are getting light, and in this case with my setup, the light is coming from the left. So all of the starting edges facing the light source coming from the left are in full light, and then we have our form shadows that stops the light on the right hand side of the object. And then let's say, for example, let's say, for example, I would say in this case, a third of the form is in shadow, 2/3 in light, or it could be, 1/4 versus 3/4, 1/4 in shadow, 3/4 in light. And what you want to do is all of your objects that have that sort of light shadow pattern, there are some objects that don't have that, but all of the objects should have the same continuity. So unless something's totally cast into shadow by something else, it's going to be the same way throughout all of your objects. So that's one key to good painting, is trying to understand and look for that consistency. The things that remain the same, even though objects are seemingly different from each other. An orange looks different from the sake vase, or from the brass bucket, or from the cloth. But we want to look for the similarities in the thing. Okay, so just looking at this, I can already get an idea of, both value structure as well as how the eye is going to come in and read the image. So one thing I'm feeling like is that this bucket, I might want to actually scooch over just a little bit more. Give a little bit more of an opening here, less of a gap in between. Because I think I'm really going to want to play up some reflected light onto the inside of this bucket to really build on the idea of atmosphere. And also right here, when it comes to ellipses, sometimes I also like to, again, think about it more in terms of diagonals, angles, like a little foreshortened stop sign here, which would be what, a hexagon? So that way, I just feel like you get easier perspective that way, instead of trying to draw a perfect oval ellipse in perspective. Now, you will have to watch out for that on your drawing, and I highly encourage everybody to just keep working on their drawing. Because any amount of drawing flaws or perspective flaws will weaken your painting. So one thing you can also do to catch yourself on anything like that is to take measurements. So you can take either just with your eye, you can see it with your eye. You don't have to necessarily have a measuring tool. But sometimes, until we really understand perspective and the illusions of what's happening, it can help to use a measuring device. A lot of times I'll just take a measurement in life from, say, the start point of the ellipse to the end point of the ellipse. How many of those would fit into from here to here? So I'll measure this against this, so that I make sure, because a lot of times what happens is people make this really big, myself included. This also happens with books and perspectives, or cubes in perspective. So the tendency is for us to want to make this a bit larger. So I'm actually going to trim it down just a little bit more here. Okay, because I think I actually did make it a bit larger. The other thing that can help you get, if there's any handles or anything on the bucket, you can kind of take a diagonal measurement, try to connect one handle to the other handle, again, just to get the perspective of the thing, so that you really communicate visually the idea that this bucket is tilted. It's not really sitting straight up and down. So it's on an angle, on a tilt. So that can be something else that can help you to figure out the perspective things that you can look for there. Okay. And I would say that is sort of the end of step one, just doing your size and placement and massing in. All right. So we've done, I took a little break there. We've done size and placement. Still, just using that mass in color. And now what I want to try to do is go in and look for shadow shapes. I've already kind of started some of them, like here, the shadow on the little sake vase curving over. And I should say we did talk about the proportions of these, and I'm still using the same mixture. I will go back in with more, of course, a different color. But for me, this really keeps it nice and simple. I don't have to think about too many things at once, which I like. You also want to look at the baseline of your objects. This is an eye level setup. I'm sitting a tiny bit above it, but not too much at all. So there's very little depth versus which, I'll do also paintings for you where I'm looking down on the objects where you're going to have more depth. So I want to look at the baselines and see if anything, like for example the sake vase is in front closer to us in space than the oranges that are behind. So you can start that off. Again, don't be too particular. You don't have to get all the little ins and outs right away. Obviously this cast shadow line is not going to be maybe that thick and bulky, but I started off nice and strong. Then on this whole mass of oranges, which is just really going to be this glorious, mass of color, just an abstract mass of color. So I might not even put in all, because there's so many little form shadows, cast shadows. There's one orange in front of another, so it casts a shadow on it, like here. So you get these little triangles of shadow where this is a form shadow, and then this orange is casting a shadow on its neighboring orange. So it really forms this little triangle shape, which is just so, aesthetically pleasing. So I'm always trying to look for these types of shapes, but I don't think I'll go too heavy there because I really just want this to be one big massive color, so I actually might not have as much value contrast from light to shadow in that area. So those are also things that I'm thinking about where, and then this object is white, so the shadow will not be that dark. But don't be afraid to go too dark in the shadows. It's really, really easy to lighten them up. It's really not a big deal at all. And again, I'm still staying with transparent color, no white yet. So I'm just kind of taking this time to fine-tune things or maybe adjust the sizes. I might make this little bucket a bit bigger because part of the beauty of this setup is the fact that we have, sort of a larger, grander object versus, we have a large, a medium, and a small essentially. This whole area over here, even though there's color on the cloth, pattern on the cloth, all of this really becomes sort of one unit. The left-hand side of the canvas is sort of Act 1, shadowy mysteriousness. And I'm going to sort of guesstimate where I want a cast shadow, if I want a cast shadow in the background, which I do, and where that's going to end. Do I want it to follow through? Is it taking up more of this portion of the canvas? So this is the time when I'm sort of playing around with those ideas to see just what might happen. Okay, what if I bring a little bit more of shadow in the background over here, sort of pointing to the climax, star of the show, bursting with the light, little sake vase over here, and the sake vase has a little bit more visual interest than some of the other things. It's really, you know, a very unique object in relationship to the rest, the other players. So I also like to think about painting in those terms. You know, how you set up a still life. You know, perhaps this is Act 1, this is Act 2, this is Act 3. Simple as that. You know, nothing too complicated. I mean, it's the basic foundation for, we have these little leaves here that I might get some idea of how much space they're going to take up in just that smaller, finer object. I like to throw in things like that sometimes. It kind of helps give a little bit of delicacy to the thing. You know, a smaller, finer thing than versus the bulkier, larger forms. Okay, on this brass bucket we have an underplane. So light coming from above, we get this beautiful highlight here. I hope all of this is, which I might just indicate just with a little bit of yellow ochre and white for now, just to give you an idea of what is going to happen. Give myself an idea, really, of what's going to happen there in the painting. Okay, and then I'm thinking, you know, here I think I do want to bring out that little ledge, the shelf edge, and how it casts a shadow on the table underneath. And that kind of is a fun area if you want to bring in some different texture, because everything else, well, the bucket's kind of beat up, so the bucket might have a little rough texture, but everything else is kind of a finer, smoother texture. So wood table edges, things like that can give you an opportunity to play up a texture change. Now, and I'm still using that burnt umber. So I think now, once I've done my shadow shape, so underplane, all of your underplanes are going to be in shadow, which is why this curves a little bit underneath, and then this casts a shadow out onto the shoulder of the sake vase. And you can use your brush two ways. So, you know, you can see too that if you want to leave that shape but you don't like that heavy paint, you can just drag with your brush, just pull with your brush and just drag that off, and it'll read as a lighter value. Okay, so just looking at all the shadow shapes, all of that looks good. And I haven't drawn in the opposite side of the contour yet. For me, there's no need to draw an actual line. What I'm going to do to get the drawing is, once I get in background color, I'm going to fine tune my drawing even further. You know, size things down, size things up, you know, really look at the symmetry, which is very important. And for me, I have a tendency to always get things lopsided. You know, maybe one day. But a lot of times what I do is I turn my painting upside down and double check, because sometimes I just can't catch it. And then I don't want to get into so much detail and paint that, you know, that I don't fix it, and I'm left with this this lopsided thing, which, you know, isn't the most terrible thing in the world. I also want to say something about that. So you want to strive for excellence and kind of know your weak points, know the things that you need to work on, and make sure that you're not being, you know, of course, slovenly in your work. But also I would say, try not to approach painting from a fear-based point of view. You must use the paint and make bold shapes, make bold decisions, and just get comfortable using your brush. You know, in the beginning, maybe, you know, you might have zero knowledge about brush manipulation, you know, how to make different edges. So that takes some time, but it takes committing to learn from to learn what your brush can do. Because if you're always just using, like here, just scrubby little bits of paint, then all of this is very vague. There's really no clarity as far as the value or the shape or even a particular color. But for example, once I, get everything set up enough to where I feel more comfortable, I want to go in for this really rich, beautiful color and beautiful value, and I can't get there from here. So this color I'm putting in for the grapes, to get the grapes started, is simply ivory black and alizarin crimson. That is pretty much the darkest color that you can get, and I also want to put it down with enough coverage so that it does read as a nice, rich dark value. And of course these grapes have lots of little details on them, highlights, dusting on the grapes, light flowing through the grapes. But for right now I just want to look at the bigness, the wholeness of the grapes. What is the one thing I could do first that would really get the function, its function in this painting, which is just a nice dark rich mass. Maybe put a little bit more ultramarine blue in that, because these do have a little bit of touch of blue. And right now it just looks so inky and dark, but this is going to be a beautiful base to work some lighter opaque colors into. So here, hopefully I'm helping you get to a better result quicker than just stumbling, in the dark, which we have to do a lot of anyway by ourselves, which is very necessary. Okay, so I'm liking that, has a nice movement, a nice gesture. I can even kind of pull off some of that if I want to indicate where the stem is. There's another little stem back here, which is kind of fun. I'll go ahead and put that in for now, and then we'll see if it actually stays throughout the finish of the painting. But I do want to start my dark, look for some of my darkest darks in the foreground right away. I would say even before I do background color, because I'm going to use this value to judge, and the richness to judge what I'm going to do for background color. So let's say if you were working on let's say in this case my background is lighter in value anyway and has more color in it. But let's say if you were just working like against a black background. That can cause a dilemma sometimes, because sometimes the mind has a way of just looking at something and saying that is black, this is black, that is black, or this is black, that is black. And the problem is that it doesn't abide by the law of atmospheric perspective. So anything that's going further back in space, we have to diminish its quality, whether it's weaker in color, or instead of it being so dark of an accent, it has to lighten up. So if you were working against a black backdrop, you would have to lighten it up to some degree in order for it to recede. Otherwise, if it's the same richness and strength as this, it's just going to flatten out your space, your sense of space in the painting. Okay, and just looking for some idea of like these little baby blackberries, which I think are nice in the sake vase. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is actually look for a more specific shadow color on the rest of the objects. Okay, so I'm going to go to a mixture that has ivory black, and this is sort of my basic go-to mixture, unless I know for certain that I have a more particular color idea in that painting. But this is a good basic place to start. Ivory black, cad red light, and cad yellow deep. And essentially it can be any colors you want, but in essence it's just a warm, glowy shadow color. And then what you can do is, of course, adjust the value of it. Like that's a little light for right there. You can adjust the value of that by adding more black and red to make it deeper and richer, more yellow to make it lighter. But the shadow of this is a little bit more lighter and airier against those grapes. I like the cadmium mixture too because it really is nice and glowy. You know, the cads are really warm, but they have a little bit of opacity to them. They're not totally transparent, of course. So I feel like it gives a really nice weight to the object, a nice solidity to the form. Okay, and some of this on the inside, get that started. And you can see how much, you know, I'm loading a really good amount of paint on the brush and just how many brush strokes I can make out of that one. Now in the shadows, I'm going for a flatter, more kind of blended or smoothed look. I'm not sure how exactly to word that, but I know that I want less activity in the shadows, so I'm also going to watch out for any glare that's picking up, you know, some of the brush strokes, because I want the eye to focus on the light, not the shadow. The shadow is really just sort of background for the light. So if you have too much information in your shadow, it can really start to actually detract from the light, which just winds up sort of killing the illusion of how we see on a day-to-day basis. So the average person never looks at shadow. Now, if you're doing a whole painting, I think based on, especially outdoors with a nice hot sun and you get all these beautiful cast shadows, and of course there may be some exceptions to the rule. You might have a whole painting that, you know, your whole point is to get people to look at the shadows. So in this case, really the light is the moving force, the driving force in this painting. So I'm still using that same mixture, and I'm really not adjusting it too much from object to object as far as the value, mostly on this one a little bit darker. And just, you know, simple shapes. Again, all of these forms can be, or these shapes can be moved around, made bigger, smaller. When you're looking at the objects, you're going to see a lot of information, just like what I was saying with the grapes. You're going to see a wealth of information, a lot of details. And, you know, for example, you might see a lot of reflected lights. You may even see a lot of color changes in the shadow. Because whenever we go to paint from life, we're staring at those areas as we're painting them. So be careful putting too much of that in right away. You sort of have to know. I think this last one's going to get a little scrunched in there. Okay, we'll just mass it all together for now and then find out what's going to happen with that, because I don't want to lose the width of this sake base. So this is going to be a nice area of overlap, you know, this edge. So you can also wipe out to, you know, if you need to get a contour back at this stage. So this edge really overlapping in front of this back orange, that's going to give a lot of depth in a painting that has very little depth. So anywhere that you can get depth to show up by means of overlap and atmospheric perspective, like we were talking about with background color versus this, go for it. Really look for those those things and make sure that you get them in nice and strong. So since I put a little bit more red into that shadow, I'm going to do the same on this since I want the color of the oranges to be really nice and strong. One thing I did leave out and I want to get in is the cast shadow coming off. It's very hard to see. This is very subtle, but I know that anytime something is sitting on top of something else, it's going to block light. It will be blocking the light from that object. So I know that I have to have some amount of shadow mixture on this cloth, and all of our cast shadows, since our light comes from top left up here, all of our cast shadows are going to be moving to the right. So cast shadows are directly underneath the object where there's no light in there whatsoever. The object is really blocking all of the light from the tabletop plane. So you always get this kind of darkest edge little line right underneath the objects, and then depending on the direction of your light source, they go out in the opposite direction of your light source. Okay, and you want to make sure your light source, I should say something about that too, and I'll probably have some sort of tutorials online somewhere about different ways to set up your light. But you do want to make sure that you know, you understand why you light something in a certain way, where you position the angle of the light. In this case, what I paint by natural light, which I think is really beautiful, but if you're using a spotlight, you want to be careful about where you position your spotlight. So in this case, light coming from above top left, all of my highlights, and then the window is slightly in front of the setup. So if you're using a spotlight, you can either do a spotlight that's, you know, slightly in front of the setup, or maybe it's a really above the setup, so that's really a top light, which you would get much more of the underplane shadows, less of the right-hand side plane shadows. So pay attention to where you put your light and just notice where your lights, where your shadows are, and where your highlights fall. So in this case, this, I feel it gives me a maximum opportunity to create the illusion of 3 dimensions by having more of the form in light, less of it in shadow, and where the highlight falls is not exactly center, just slightly left of center, pulling the eye into the center of the form and away from these outer contours. So I can go ahead and just suggest where those highlights are going to be, even though these won't remain there in the state that they're in. So, but just to give you an idea of the direction of my light source. Okay, take a little break. Okay. All right, so next stage is background. I'm going to do some background color, and then, yes, we get into the lights. Since I did some little highlights on these other objects just to indicate the plane changes, and also the areas of the form where the eye is going to concentrate on, because that is really what the eye focuses on, is these little pinpoints of light. So even, for example, on these grapes, you know, I might not give every single grape a highlight. So otherwise it might get too active or too busy there visually. And I really just want those to be sort of the dark, ambiguous, to some degree, somewhat more ambiguous mass, less detailed than the rest. So if everything is given the same amount of attention and detail and clarity, a couple of things is that there's really no pace to your picture, like the person seeing your painting, you know, will maybe stay too long in one area before going to the next area. There's no relationship between, or a hierarchy, I guess I would say, between this object being more visually interesting and exciting than, say, these objects over here. And since I love painting brass so much, and grapes, that's something I'll have to watch out for, that, I make sure that I'm really paying attention to the story that I wanted to tell here. And then I'm not just indulging my ability to paint grapes and make grapes look interesting. I'm still going to make them beautiful, but what's more interesting or more beautiful to me is sort of this visual story that I'm trying to tell. Okay. So I'm going to get a little bit darker value back here, but still keeping it relatively thin. And I'm kind of thinking about this whole painting being in some shades, a variety of shades that are in the brass. Sort of these grays and greens, less colorful colors, so that the reds and the orange and yellows really pop. So this background color I'm doing is yellow ochre, ivory black, and some raw umber. And that gives you a really nice sort of earthy, soft green. And so I'm going to start with that. And right now it's really the same value as, say, my shadow mass in color here. And I also will just kind of go over stuff that I put in earlier, just because I'm just going to kind of scrub this on a little bit here, because it's going to be too difficult to paint around those things. So while I needed to put it in when I first started, just to see, their size, the delicacy of it, the height, get some idea, how high they're going to go up in the canvas. So up here I might stay really loose with my background color, especially up here in the corners. And then as I get around my objects, it's going to become a little bit more important to me to get a little more coverage there. And I think at this stage I'm even going to throw in like a little bit more of my lead tin yellow into the mix to just, cool it off in some more yellow ochre and get a little slightly more airy feel there, atmospheric or light filled. So opacity is sort of our tool to say this is lighted, this is lit, versus transparency, which again the eye is not going to look at. So I do want to get some amount of more coverage here. And as you're working wet into wet with painting, you're going to get edges, you might lose a contour, lose an edge here or there. I'm going to pull this all around, or lose some of your drawing or something you did before. And to me that is just fine. I would rather do that so that I don't wind up with like dark outlines around my objects, especially around the lit edges. So if light is first hitting that lit edge, it's first hitting this lit edge strongest. So I know that I want more light sort of bouncing off into the atmosphere right there. Okay. And since I put this in, I think I'm going to just adjust the shadow for that background with some ivory black, cad yellow deep here, maybe a little touch of the ultramarine. So I'm always making my best judgment on these colors. We have to get something going here. And then, so I'm trying to think ahead as much as I can. What is this value going to look like up against this one? Trying to pull on my experience, 8 years of painting to inform my decision to some degree. But I always know that, there may be adjustments later on down the road. But you have to be decisive, even if you're not sure if the answer is right. I think you've got to make a choice and put it down, and put down enough of it so that you can see if it's going to work or not. And at this stage, there's no way for me to really know that. I'm just like, this color I'm relating to maybe the dark handle, but I also know there's going to be a little bit of light on that handle. Those sorts of things are my thought process. And mostly I'm thinking I want this value to be a little bit, of course, darker than, say, the light on the sake vase, in a different color as well than, say, the orange. I wouldn't paint in bright orange, of course. So I'm thinking about how in the future the colors I'm going to put here, the values I'm going to put here is going to look against this background color. And I've set my still life up to try to get it to look as good as I want it, as good as I can, but I'm also not wanting to be a slave to what I set up. So, that's where you kind of have to be a little bit intuitive as to, in just looking at your canvas a little bit more than, say, just, oh, well, if I just copy the setup, then I'll have a good painting. Because sometimes, you might have a reasonable painting, but it might lack a little bit of just certain something, a little excitement, or so that's where your creativity, your humanity comes in, your intelligence comes in to inform your choices. Because actually the backdrop that's up there is a very cool gray-green, and with this painting I'm thinking the warmth, this would be nicer if it's a little bit warmer than what I'm actually seeing. Since all my colors are really warm, rich warm reds and oranges. I mean, the brass has, sort of that yellow-green in it. So that's why, that would be why I made that decision. Instead of going according to what I'm seeing, it would be a sort of off-putting if I totally change the temperature of the background according to what the rest of the color scheme is in the rest of the painting. All right. Okay, so I've added in some more, basically took the background color, and added in a little bit more color saturation. So the same colors I used back here, cad yellow deep, some ultramarine blue, some yellow ochre, and I've just kept the black out of it so that I get still a quieter color, especially on this top back edge, which I want to recede a little bit more. So I also get something sort of harmonious. So I want to get something going there that is emerging out of the background, but maybe not so bold that it really jolts attention from the eye. So we've got a nice hard edge here where this meets the background, a harder edge on the interior, and I can punch that up just a little bit more. But I want to just do enough and move on to the next area of the painting, because that's what the whole painting is about, is these relationships, one object to another. So here I might use the palette knife to build a little bit of, and that just had some lead tin yellow in that highlight. Lead tin yellow, some white, and a little touch of ochre. And just putting it on with a palette knife, especially because this object is a little, and just kind of skipping it around, dragging. this object has sort of a hammered, beat up look to it, and this is just a heck of a lot of fun to do. And unfortunately, it's so much fun, and you get the effect so quickly that you want to keep doing it, but but then you might lose the beauty of that thin versus thick, transparent versus opaque, and but we'll see. We'll see. But for now, that's enough for me. Gives me the overall, you know, if I could do 3 things to make that bucket look like that brass bucket, what would it be? So for me, that's enough of the characteristic of the thing, the character of it, and maybe just how the light, you know, continues up. We get another highlight here on the edge of the rim here. And the rest is just sort of filling in the gaps or filling in some details. Might beef up that highlight again, since I did kind of mush it around in there. Especially here, it kind of goes all the way across the form, but especially right there. So right now everything's kind of in a monochromatic, warm world. And where we're only going to deviate from that little bits and pieces here and there. And those are also going to be sort of areas that we look at in the painting, because the temperature changes, you know, especially blues or greens or purples, you know, might stand out a bit more against all of this, this warmth. Okay. And just having fun with the paint, you know, just seeing what you can do with the paint. And so I am going to wipe this little contour edge off now, because it's so dark, and that is really going to be just this beautiful edge of, you know, brilliant orange. And I went to the store today, found these. This wasn't quite exactly what I was hoping to find, but it's, you know, it's December. And you know, they didn't really have a whole lot. So these have a lot of red and orange in them, and I think I'm actually going to push them more to the yellow, a little bit more of a yellow orange than what I'm seeing. I just think in the case of this painting, I think that's going to be more pleasant, and it's going to allow me to lighten the value. You know, if I put too much orange and red in there, it's going to be a little bit, that automatically red is darker than yellow, so so it's going to allow me to bring in a lighter value. All right. So, and it's also a good idea, make sure you take breaks often enough. You know, you want to work for a good amount of time, but take enough breaks so that you can get some distance from the painting and see how everything is reading from a distance, especially if you're sitting and painting like I'm doing today, videoing this. You're right up on top of it, so you need to make sure that you are backing up. I would say at least every half hour or so. And you can also, you know, just see things more clearly. Like, for example, I could see that this shoulder of the contour I had kind of flattened out. So you can see if things maybe are out of symmetry or a little crooked, or you know, like all of these, which I'll do in paint too, but just to show you that edge, you know, maybe round that edge a little bit more. Same thing, push out on this edge. It was a little bit caved in, just how it appeared on the massing in, which I might not do on another painting, but just to show you that example. I mean, I might not fix it, in other words, right away. I might fix it with paint instead of wiping out, is what I'm trying to say. Most of the time I try to make any and all changes that I need to make with paint, unless I just know that I really need to scrape that off or wipe that out and start again. I always try to make any adjustments, and I like to call them adjustments, not corrections. I don't like to be in the mindset of the whole painting is just a series of corrections. To me, it could be adjustments, but not really, corrections. Okay, so now, and I should say something about the setup again, in that it's a good idea to have a variety of, values and colors, but you also don't want to be maybe too all over the place or too circusy. So you want to have some organization or just a plan. So again, just recapping, my plan was everything to be in some sort of color world as what is found in the brass bucket. And to me, that's sort of like this neutral sort of warmish greens, grayish greens, brown greens, more, again, that's just basically warm green. And then we get our more intensity of color player in the oranges. And then our lightest light in the sake base, as well as some color accents in that sake base too. Okay, so it's a very simple idea, which doesn't sound like much whenever you talk about it verbally, but it's a beautiful idea visually. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the color and light on the oranges. And when you start to work the lights, you really have to make sure that you're not mixing as vigorously, broadly, where your piles are very thin on the palette. So if your paint looks thin on the palette, it's going to be very difficult to pick paint up with your brush. So just to show you, for example, like this brush, I have the color of my light, and I've just been mixing with the very tip of my brush. So I've got all this beautiful thicker paint on the very tip of my brush, whereas this with the darker mixtures that I've wanted to apply more thinly, I can use more medium to thin the paint, and I can mix a little more vigorously, and the paint I'm kind of scrubbing on almost in a way, even though I'm not directly scrubbing with the brush. So that's just something to keep in mind whenever you do switch to working the lights, that you actually want to mix your color a little differently, and you want that to really just lay on the surface of the panel or the canvas. And again, the less absorbent your surface is, the better. The more beautiful, this paint, and more colorful and more lit up it's going to look at the end of the painting. I should say too, like, if I wanted to show you the different shapes of these cast shadows, but I think how I would actually really want to paint it is sort of just paint it as a mass of color, which I think I'm going to do. Just kind of paint over this for now. This is how my instinct would tell me to paint this in this case, because really my idea was that this would be sort of like this, even though they're individual oranges, that it really functions more as just this big massive movement of color, of this more brilliant saturated color. So I'll just kind of paint over, and I can paint more light into this. And you can see, I can kind of flatten out, and I can kind of mix it in with the original shadow color that was there. And I can paint more lights onto this. But, this is how ideally I would sort of envision painting those. But I wanted to really, more than just these two things, show you how you would look for those cast shadows and form shadows whenever you have a stack of fruit like that, or of anything really that's kind of stacked together. Okay. And then I don't use, you can use whatever you want to clean your brushes. I just use paper towels to wipe my brushes in between. I don't really like to clean my brushes throughout, so through, basically through proper mixing, that needs, oh, I should tell you what color this is too. Proper mixing with the brush, I can kind of, and brush handling, not scrubbing in. Like here, I picked up some of the undercolor, so if I want to lay something on without picking that up, or what's underneath, I've got to do it with such a pressure, painting it flatly, and with a gentle enough pressure that it's just going to lay on top of what's it like here. So you can paint thicker, light on top of something that's a little darker and murkier underneath. And I was going to tell you too the colors I used on this, which was the cad yellow light, a little bit of cadmium yellow deep, because the cad yellow light is a little too lemony and cool, so it needed a little bit of that orangey color, and also a little bit of white, a little bit of flake white, which is the white that I like to use. So it does need a little touch of white. The cadmium is a touch too strong in this case, to really look lit up. So all of my lights have some feeling of the coolness of light hitting it. Now if I want to, I can maybe fine-tune these shadows a little bit more. And my initial idea was not to go too heavy and dark on the form shadow on these. Of course I want a value change, but even that one might be a little bit too dark. But I really wanted these to just feel so full of light. So one way that you can make something feel more lit up, is by make it feel like it's just flooded with light, is by filling the shadow with a little bit more reflected light, or raising the value of the shadow. At least that's my feeling on it. And I think that's a good color and a good value range, and within that I can also maybe put in some stronger reflected lights in the underplanes or from a neighboring orange. Now this one feels quite big now in comparison to these guys over here, so that's something else you want to keep track of. Make sure that that you're not losing proportion between things. So I can make it a little bit smaller whenever I go to paint it. And I have a feeling that maybe the sake base, well, I don't know, I like its size, so I'll probably just keep it. And I should say something about that, and that is that you do want to watch out for sizing things too big, because it will, feel bigger as you work the painting. And the space, you want some amount of atmosphere and space for these things to exist in. So there's always sort of a good balance. I'm just using some of that orange color to get into the background. So that's another way you can make something feel more bright, is by letting its color spill out into the neighboring atmosphere, the neighboring area. And let's backtrack a little bit. Oh, there's so much to explain about what I'm doing. So when it comes to form, you want your lit edge, which is the edge facing the light source, the direction of your light source, to be nice and crisp and clean. And you don't want to gray that down. You want nice clean color. You want to start it off at the value that you need it to be, and then we will change the value in the highlight. You know, the highlight will be the only thing to really break the value structure. And then we still have our nice crisp shadow edge that's kind of darker right here, which I might leave a little bit darker since this one's all by itself and this is sort of the last shadow on the canvas. I might have that stay as a more abrupt stop there, whereas these, they're all so, you know, gathered together that maybe they're just bouncing so much of their light into each other. So then, just like a little cube, you know, we talked about this thing being a cube. The top of the cube is a flat plane going all the way across. So your form shadow actually starts more here, underneath the shelf edge, just like a shelf edge. You know, unless something is sitting on top of it, the light is just going to flow across the top of that edge. So especially with these little, I think little clementines is what they're called. You're going to see more of that than, say, like a navel orange. It's more rounded. And then, so now this shadow is carried over a little bit too much. And then just how you ease off, it's the same color that's in the light, which is just so cool. And then how you ease off into the shadow, you can see that it actually makes the shadow, when you soften that edge, it actually makes the shadow not look quite as harsh as it did before, you know, where we had a harder edge. So, you know, clarity is going to give you contrast. So if you want to take some attention away from that area and weaken the clarity or weaken the contrast, it's just let the light, you know, sort of trickle over that edge a bit. And then, you know, I can do a little bit of reflected light in here, but I don't want to be as bold, or I better hold off on doing that. I'm getting ahead of things. Okay. Alrighty, it's so much fun seeing these things start to come to life as you're working. I had to take a little break there and reload my Cad Yellow Light and Cad Yellow Deep. So that's another thing you want to take breaks for, is if you need to clean up your palette or get a fresh paper towel, reload paint, anything like that, because you want to always make sure that you're working with good quality supplies. And just to show you, here's an example of my paper towel so far. And this is, again, all I use to clean the brushes with as I'm working. And then I will wash them at the end of the day. Okay. All right. So, need to start to get some light on. I'm going to let these things start to set up a little bit. That's another thing about learning to work with paint, is just really beginning to understand the little nuances of how the paint sets up, you know, how it feels at the beginning of the painting and how it feels towards the end of the painting. Now I put in my medium, it actually speeds up the drawing process of the painting. So if you're using a different kind of medium, you'll have to gauge the time period, you know, between start of the painting and when the paint really starts to set up. That's important because when the paint's really soft, as I'm talking, I'm going to start massing in some color for this wood tabletop. so that I'm actually doing something. Okay. Little. Okay, so it's important because this just has some burnt umber, yellow ochre, little touch of cadmium red, just a nice warm color, not quite as green as the background, but still somewhat neutral. So the paint quality in the beginning is really soft. There's not a whole lot of detail stuff you can do with it. So that's really the stage of the painting that you want to be working in big, bold shapes, just simple. Your painting might look very elementary looking possibly at that stage. But the trouble I see a lot of times that people get into is they try too quickly to really get into more detailed stuff when the paint just is not ready to work with them yet. All right. Now we also have light on this wood tabletop plane. And so basically everything that is in light is going to have some amount of white paint in it. To some degree. So we've communicated here the quality, the color of our light or the quality of our light, sort of that coolness, the cool opacity. So anything that gets lighted is going to have some amount of that in it. It can be just the smallest amount. So we'll get into that, especially with the grapes. In this tabletop light can change. We don't have to I don't have to make it the same color or same value, same intensity of light hitting it, for example, all the way across. Now here I might have a little bit more of the orange color in there from the oranges, the little clementines, and then maybe I think it's nice to show some, especially on this side of the contour over here, some idea of light on the tabletop plane back behind. And I kind of cut into that a little bit. Caved in my contour. That's okay. Again, that I think it's really important that you don't see paint as so set in stone. And actually, that's what I love about oil paint. It's what I didn't like when I first started painting. I tried to do acrylics, and for one thing, I just didn't like how fast it would dry. And I was making so many mistakes, so I just never got into that material very well. So that is one benefit, I think, of working with oils, is just the fact that they don't dry right away. You can change an edge like that pretty easily, and again, getting some amount of light behind, so we have light, dark, dark, light, can just add a little extra illusion of something else being back behind this sake vase and orange here. So a little bit of table space there, and I may wind up, we'll see what happens with the background back here. A lot of times my backgrounds are the things that might change the most. Or get the most adjustments, because I can really use whatever's back behind something to pull something out or make it more mysterious. So, like for example, what I just did here on this back edge of this orange, if I have a harder edge there where the light meets the shadow, that's going to give a little bit more overlap and sense of space. Okay, and this light against the dark, another again just a point of a place, another place for the eye to land. Okay, so let's get into some light. Actually, what I might do first, since I did a little bit more wood table edge there, and I might do a little bit more sort of a texture. I don't want it to maybe have as much texture as the brass bucket, but some amount of texture there. So we do try some burnt umber and cad yellow deep, something that's a slight variation to what I have down, and then maybe make a lighter version of that. And kind of use my palette knife to sort of drag that, try to get rid of that darker edge. And I can come back into that and work that later on. But that should be enough for now. There's, you know, some red, some black in this cloth. And so I want to get some suggestion of that pattern in the cloth and the color, you know, the color that it's going to bring in. All right. So I like to, on this cloth, it's sort of broken down into two different segments or sections. So the part of the cloth that has the black, and again, we want to paint light on black. So I want to make sure I don't just do, you know, straight up jet black. So in this case, I've got a little bit of yellow ochre and raw umber in there, just to give it a slight bit of coolness, because light is on this cloth. But you can see it's not, I'm not jumping the value super, super light. So this is sort of where the black is ending. And I'm also wanting to pay attention, you know, maybe I actually want to bring the cloth over a little bit more and maybe have the black end a little bit higher, because I think this could be used sort of as a directional device to the, you know, sort of Act 3. All right. So if the predominant value in that area of the cloth and predominant color is in this black family, I'll start it off with that, and then I'll add the red detail on top, and vice versa. If the predominant area of that part of the cloth is in the red family, I'll start it off with the red, especially here, closer to the point of interest. Start it off with the red and then add the black on top. So I'll go ahead and get some, I just add some cad red to the same mixture I was working with for now. This won't really feel too lighted at the moment, but I can paint some more light on top of it. But it will at least give me the color family that I'm after. You know, and this side's going to get more light built on it, say, than this side. I might just do sort of a suggestion. Like, you know, how much of that do we really even need to see? So you also have to watch out for that, because the temptation sometimes is to put everything in. And my rule of thumb is always, you know, front and center out to peripheral area. So, you know, this zone is not quite as important as, say, over here by the oranges, or closer to Act 2 and Act 3, if that makes sense, or closer to the grapes. Okay, and I think I've used up that paper towel now. So I'm going to grab another one. So just trying to make sure that everything has its, to some degree, a specific identity to each thing, that each thing is basically identifiable as being different than another thing. So, and keeping all the values, like even the value of the black and the red are really close. The value of the grapes still hold together as a dark mass. The value of, the oranges all hold really close together. So those are things I'm watching out for. And it especially gets tricky, the more you try to perhaps get into more detail, is maintaining the value structures. And I would like to get some idea of the highlights on these oranges. And if I'm working on this is an 11 by 14. So if I'm working on a smaller painting like this, I will use, a little skewer. This is just one of those cooking skewers to put down an initial highlight. And again, I want to get it on there because it is really soft and buttery. It doesn't like to be manipulated too much, you can see it's just kind of gooey, and of course also the more medium I have in it, some days I get too much medium, some days I get just the right amount. So let's see, maybe punch up this one a little bit more. And again, this can be adjusted. I would rather put it on too thick and gloppy in the beginning. And as it sets up and as I go back in and work the light a little bit more on that orange, I can carve it down and get it to be finer, smaller. Okay. So light on the sake vase. When you're dealing with white objects, you want to decide, is it a cold white, meaning it has a lot of blue in it, or is it maybe a warmer white, maybe, like an ivory or something bent more towards the yellow. So in this case, I'm going to go for a little bit more of a warmer, has a little bit more of that yellow in it. And when I do paint this, I think I might also make it a little bit bigger as I'm working. Or you can do, of course, blue and orange is always a good idea when you're dealing with white or some type of complementary color, and then bend it either to the warmer family or the cooler family. Okay. Just nice, bold edges. Don't be afraid of the paint, as I'm telling myself. Preaching to the choir. And I think I might adjust this shape a little bit now. It seems like I shortchanged its shape a little bit, and this is a hair fat, so I'll go back into background color and adjust that. Kind of flares out to the bottom here, so we're really gonna kind of lose that. And you can just see how creamy this back orange here, but that's okay. This is more, the sake vase is more important than one seeing that orange in full clarity. Now we do have sort of a blue stripe on here, which is really pretty, some gold accents, another band up here, but I always like to do the underneath neutral color first, since I would just want to get a nice, just like on the oranges, just a nice light and shadow pattern. And you can grab some background color, always on your turns, that the plane that's turning away from the light. So for example, this is getting full light, then we get that full light, highlight. It's this part of the form that starts to turn away from the light, that you can lose intensity of color or intensity of light. So the background color is a really great thing to use, you know, and of course you always just you're always looking at your painting, making sure, does it work? Sometimes just grabbing some of the straight background color, it's too colorful or it's too dark, or vice versa, you know. So use it as a starting point, because the main idea, basic principle, is that background color is the color of your space or atmosphere. So anything that is getting closer, going back towards that space, will take on some of the space color. So that's the basic guiding principle, and then you have to judge your painting and see, you know, does it need a little bit more of something, or something else, more color, or less value contrast, more value contrast, a harder edge, a softer edge. Okay. So that's gotten some good light started on it. And this part of the form, so our top plane, since our light is coming from top left, our top planes are getting more light. So everything that's, like, for example, flat is going to get more light than, say, up and down. So depending on, you know, for example, this turns really quickly and abruptly away and under, away from the light. So that's going to have a more abrupt value change. Whereas this, you know, is more of a tapering out. But there's definitely more of a little bit of a lip or an angle to the light here. And of course, one way we can start to indicate that is through the highlight. To actually use a palette knife or brush because the paint's so soft. And the angle of this, you know, is going to go with the angle of this side of the contour facing the light. And I guess I should say too that is, you know, the quality of the oil paint is the thing that people have, maybe the hardest thing that they have to get used to, especially when it comes to working with the white. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this form shadow back in. Started off again with a little bit harder edge since I was really adjusting the shape of that. On white objects too, sometimes I like to use the ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, or even like Naples yellow or lead tin yellow and ivory black, since it is a little bit lighter of a value. So it still reads as being warmer and, you know, more transparent than what I have here in the light, but not too dark and inky. Now, as you're working, you're going to start to find areas of, you know, perhaps problem areas of, okay, well now this, you know, the edge is totally lost. How can I bring that out? So we have to bring back in the background color and carve that edge out a little more forcefully there. Because like here, everything is so close to being the same. You know, it's trying to figure out will I have to make a change if I want this to stand out a little bit more? And I know that, you know, those little stripes are going to help. And we don't have to see the whole entire edge in clarity. Whoops. In full clarity, but you also don't want either your starting edge or your ending edge to be too soft and mushy. So even this, you know, is a little too soft to me. I'm going to add a little bit more color, more paint back on there and try to recapture that edge a little bit stronger. And on white objects, you want both warms and cools in the form, you know, so that it feels believable. It reads as a little bit more as a neutral instead of just, otherwise it can start to maybe look like, oh, this is a blue vase or a yellow vase. So it needs some of these neutrals in there. And then in this area is actually where we have this beautiful, rich, deep blue band, which is just gorgeous. Okay. And I think that's going to be enough there for now. And I'm not sure yet. I want to back up and re-look at this, think about this background color a little bit more before I paint these leaves. Okay. One thing I can probably do while this is giving this some time, and I think I'm going to pull off where I'm going to put that rich blue base because that's a lot of white right there, so I can kind of draw where it's going to go just by pulling the paint off with my brush and wiping with my brush, and maybe a little bit here, although here is more of a lit up zone. This is more lit up here than down here, so I may not want to pull too much of that off, but that's where that second stripe is going to be. Okay. All right. Okay, so we've got our big light giver in. I need to get some more details on the grapes, also on the cloth, the fabric here. So let's start with the grapes. You know, the grapes always have that nice dusting. It looks sort of like a frosty dusting on them. And so since this paint has been setting up for a little bit now, I'm going to take a little small bit of white, but this value, you know, maybe is a little bit, maybe a touch too bright, I don't know. A little bit of white with my ivory, my grape mixture essentially, or you could even use, in this case, some background color might be nice, especially on the ones closer back in space, closer to the background, I should say, and kind of mix that in with the underneath color. So it's like you're combining the two values, sort of what we did on the brass. Combining the two values together, but leaving some bits of each showing through, a little more pure. So it's almost like doing a little scumbling, sort of a fake scumbling. So where I start to pull that dusting out is also important. It can help separate one grape out from another, or like, for example, if I want the shadow maybe on the under layer of the brass pot, I think that can go a little bit maybe a little bit darker right there. One thing I did also want to do is get some amount of sort of that glow from the oranges into this opening on the inside of the brass. Sometimes too you can just kind of drag some of it out and then go back and sort of recapture some of these, get those crisp edges back. But I think, you know, a lot of times you get to more interesting edges by letting things sort of come and go and not being afraid to some extent to destroy something or mess something up, seemingly mess something up, you know. Put a little bit of that around the lit edges as well. And maybe we don't need quite such a direct, overt cast shadow pointing to the sake base. And this would be a good stage too, once everything is kind of in, to turn it upside down and make sure, you know, that you straighten anything up. I think I'm going to put in a little bit of the stem on the grapes. The stem is pretty dried out in life, so I'm going to make it a little bit more colorful and beautiful in the painting. So that has some cad yellow deep and basically the color of the oranges plus a little bit of what am I trying to say? Blue. Ultramarine blue. Okay. And a little piece of it kind of sticks out down here, which I think might be nice. Some of this green is actually in the cloth too, on some of the pattern of the cloth, so I might go ahead and get some suggestion of some of that in. That's a little too big and not very distinct as far as the drawing goes, but I can fine-tune that here in a little bit. And if you do anything that does need to be fine-tuned, you can just use the color if you have enough paint down. And that's the other good thing about using enough paint, is you can use the color that is around it to simply, you know, carve it into a finer shape. And, you know, sometimes I actually like to leave some of this thinner and more transparent, maybe more of that crimson showing through. So on the opposite side of the grapes, instead of shadow, one characteristic of things being more translucent, and this kind of got the idea, but is that it gets a little bit of light passing through, just like a piece of glass. The light is going to move through the object. And, you know, maybe especially these ones that are closer to a little bit closer to the orange. I might put a little bit more cad yellow deep in there. And sometimes as you're working too, you might lose crispness of your edges there on the grapes. So you want to get those back. And then I do like this little stem here. There's some suggestion of that coming through. And I think, like, for example, this edge, everything kind of runs in together. So if it's an area that I think I might want to have a little more overlap, that means I've got to, I think the first place to start is to always look at the edge. Because it might be nice that, you know, we're not jumping color and jumping value so much, but maybe we can solve the problem just with a little bit of an edge change and achieve that overlap with an edge. And then where these grapes, I need to switch back to a little bit bigger brush. I pulled a little bit smaller brush out to do more of the details now that we're, I guess I should say that too, that's a good way to work too, is that you work from a big brush to a little smaller brush. Okay. And then some of the red on this cloth, a little bit of cad red light. I'd say a little touch of Naples yellow or yellow ochre. The lead tin yellow or Naples yellow does have, some of that cool opacity of the white, but without maybe going too pinky on you. So with reds, anytime that you want to raise the value or make it look lighted, but you don't want it to go too pink, I think always adding a little bit of orange or yellow into the mix is a good idea. And this could start to get way too busy really quick, so that'll be another thing that I'm trying to keep track of as I work it, how much. A lot of times I'll put something in and then I'll go, okay, well, I think that actually sort of detracted from the story I was trying to tell, so maybe eliminate some of that, or how could I make it, quiet it, kind of leave part of it there, but maybe quiet it down a bit. Whether that's, maybe softening some edges or weakening the color or the value change. Or making less of the pattern, perhaps in this case. Oh, I'm out of black. Shoot. Okay. So we're getting to, more finishing touches now. I want to make sure I do a little bit of something on everything for you to finish, so you have an idea of, where you might go with it. Sometimes little things like this back here, just flattening out with your brush or with a palette knife, so that it's less, again, just taking out some of the brush strokes. Even something like that can be a little distracting, so even just, kind of flattening it out with a knife. And the paint really has a nice pull now. I'll say something about that too, is that depends on, in the wintertime you might be running, like now you might be running a lot of heaters, so the air is very dry and your paint's going to dry faster. Or if you live in a dry climate, it'll dry faster. Whoops, don't know what I grabbed there. Picked up some shadow color somewhere, but it's okay. I kind of like the variation instead of it being just such a flat, all one color background. I kind of like this variation. Okay. All right, so let's get the stripes, or the, more of the details on the bands here on the sake vase. Sometimes too, if right away, you want to keep a little bit of those color variations, but you just don't like the busyness of the brushwork, you can just kind of scrape it off and, leave some of that there. I'll go back in and work that. I don't like to leave anything on the canvas that I feel like, if it's really distracting me while I'm working, it's not going to be Good. Okay. Take that off for now. And it doesn't mean that that won't get put in. It just means for whatever reason at this moment in time, I just don't enjoy it being there. Or maybe because maybe I rushed and so it just wasn't well thought out. So that might be a case where I might really take something off. All right, so I've got this, I've kind of made this really beautiful, almost like a Prussian or phthalo blue-green, but using ultramarine blue. So I used ultramarine blue, ivory black, and a little touch of cad lemon. And then as I get closer to the center and the left-hand side of the form, I'm going to be lightening that even more. Right now it's kind of dark and inky. So I want it to, look a little more lit up as I come around here in the middle. So we kind of have all of these really warm, sort of desaturated colors in the painting. And then these touches of these sort of rich jewel tone colors, which I think is really beautiful. And then in the shadow, it has to feel like it's that color in shadow. So no white. White will cool it off too much. And so we'll kind of just do the blue, the black, maybe even a little touch of red, we'll see. And this is one of those areas I was talking about, like that dark edge of the band could be just enough, enough of a darker accent against the background to separate it out from the background. And then what's really fun, which makes this object a little more interesting to look at, is to build up this reflected light from the orange. So you want to kind of start it off soft with your brush, sort of mixed in, and then you can give it a hit of, a little more strength, a little more harder edge there. Okay. Now, as I was working, I did kind of lose this cast shadow underneath the sake vase, so that's pretty important to get that back in. And I'm realizing now that maybe the color on my table edge is a little too similar to the color of the vase, so I'll just bring back in a little bit more of the warms, the ochre and the red, to distinguish that. And this is really fun. There's like this beautiful vermilion color stripe band up here. But since I have so much white down, I might just think, well, it's a little too red. Needs a little bit more of the yellow deep. That was just straight up cad red light painted into that, and I'm not thrilled. I think to be a little bit more harmonious with the oranges, but still feel like a different color, I'm going to put a little bit of the orange color into that. So you also don't have to always mix. We'll replace that highlight. Don't always have to mix an exact color on your palette. You can, paint nicely into, I think it was Rockwell that called it painting into the soup, and I've heard that saying a lot from other artists as well. So there's a lot of sort of beautiful nuances that I think you can get by doing that. And this is a little too straight across looking at it now when I put that little stripe in. or band. Just not sure what to call that. So you can come back and give it a little bit more curve. Since it's not exactly on my eye level, it's a little bit below eye level. Same thing here. Otherwise, it does feel a little bit strange, you know? Like, why is that just so straight across? Doesn't quite feel right. And do the same thing. So as things get closer to your eye level, those ellipses, the perspective on the ellipses, flatten out. And as they go below your eye level, you know, it's going to make, I always say it's like a smiley face, somewhat of a smiley face. And as it goes above your eye level, like this one's perfectly straight because that's pretty much exactly on my eye level. So that one really does not hardly curve at all. And then as things go above your eye level, like if you're on the street looking up at something, you're going to see that curves, anything that has ellipses is going to curve upward like a frowny face. There's got to be a better term for that that doesn't sound so elementary. But for some reason that was the thing I came up with in my head when I was learning. And I noticed it either looked like a frowny face, a straight face, or a smiley face. And I don't know why, that just kind of stuck with me. Okay. All right, and so we need to get a little bit more of that highlight back. I think it might be nice to put some on the band there, some on the porcelain, so it's going to change a little bit in color. And your highlights, you always want it to have sit on top of the underneath color, because you're trying to not only, you know, get the illusion of the light culminating sort of at its maximum amount of burnout of local color there, but also you're trying to create another edge, sort of an inside focal edge. And I think I'm going to try to use my strokes on this underneath to kind of curve with the swell of the form there, and see if I can't fine tune that edge a little bit more. This edge got a little, again, just a little bit over softened. And I'm hesitant to get rid of that little piece of red because I actually kind of like it. So sometimes things like that, that's personal preference on whether or not you like some of those little accidents. Do they bring to the thing or not? There's been times whenever I've looked at, you know, maybe some old William Merritt Chase paintings, or, you know, somebody's painting like that, and I'll just see this sort of random piece of color just hanging out somewhere, but it just worked. It worked, brought a little more interest to the thing. All right, and then there's a little bit of this like gold type of filigree, I don't know what you call it, some type of design and pattern in here, which it might be nice, I think, to suggest a little bit of and some of it is on the red as well. So basically this is red, yellow, and blue. You could do burnt umber and cad yellow, but at this point I have like the red of the stripe, the blue-green of the stripe, the yellows, and so I'm just kind of mixing them all together to sort of get this brassy, again, some of that sort of brassy color to indicate this gold. And where the gold has a little bit of highlight, it's mostly the yellow and white. So that brings a little bit more visual interest to the thing. There's also like this writing, and I wanted to do the main bands first and see, you know, how that went. Did I feel like it needed the writing? And I do. I feel like it needs that little extra bit of pattern on there. So I'm just going to suggest, kind of also gives that sort of Asian feeling. Now, one thing to talk about too with the perspective on this is, again, like, you know, these curved lines curve down as they go underneath my eye level. I put those brushes up. So anything closer to this side of the contour is going to curve out towards this contour. When it comes more in the center, it's going to be more straight up and down. And when it gets closer to it's going to slight curve this way, you know, as it comes closer to the this side of the contour. So this side of the contour is curving out this way. The other side's wrapping around, pushing out the opposite direction, giving us the illusion of 3 dimensions. The challenge with this is painting the paint flat enough so that we don't get all these little dabby doos. That's a professional term for it, dabby doos. I'm going to paint that reflected light back on top of that now. You know, things like pushing that reflected light, how far can you go with that? Do you want to intensify that or weaken that? You know, things like that are at this stage what you're contemplating doing. Playing around with ideas like that, again, instead of just trying to replicate exactly what you're seeing. Okay. I always like to have a little bit of cool, especially on white objects, you know, if it's a warm white, a little bit of cool transition color on the turn into shadow. So basically I grabbed some of that stripe color plus the background color and white. Then the red needs to read a little bit darker on the band in shadow, so some ivory black and cab red and a little touch of crimson will do that. And so you can see some of these darker accents really start to pull the object away from, oh, that was a little too dark, from the background color, whereas before they were so close. So, but I knew that having the benefit of having those, you know, the stripes and all of that there was going to sort of save the day, while still keeping that beautiful sort of harmony in the painting. You know, not to say that I wouldn't touch it again or that it's perfect, but okay. And a lot of, you know, for me, a lot of times it's back and forth, you know, trying to get the right shifts and the right edges happening. So how lost do I want an edge to be? I think I can also let a little bit more light spill out on this lit edge. Oh, that might be way too much. A little more color in it. It's really, again, it's easier to fix a lot of paint, I think, than a little bit of paint. So if it's too little, it just wants to like blend in and not be seen. It's hard to move it around or even to scrape it off. It's even easier to scrape off a little bit of paint. But I think that gives a little bit more atmospheric feeling. Also, all right, might want to take a little break and take a photo. All right, so this is going to be the last final push here, but I hope that you've gained a lot of information that's useful to you, and more than anything, I hope that I've stressed enough that if you stay focused on what your visual story is and don't get lost in just, rendering and copying what you're seeing, always go back to what was my idea, what was my act 1, my act 2, my act 3, where am I trying to get the eye to move towards. I think you will, finish your paintings quicker, also, and start off with better ideas, All right, so at this stage, just looking for things like, okay, quieting down again some of this background. Might actually need to add a little bit more paint, but I like some of that texture. Sometimes I even kind of walk some of that into the belly, the underplane. Again, I'm looking for some cools. Everything can't just be so hot. The overall temperature of this, I want to be warmer, but then I also need some relief from that. So some of these, cooler blue-greens as we turn into shadow. And on this guy, there is some reflected light from the red. I don't know. I'm not sure because I don't have the red that strong yet up here. So I don't think I'm going to put that in just yet. Let's go back to the oranges. First, I actually feel like maybe if this did go a little bit darker, it might, pop that bucket a little bit more and kind of give me a chance to sort of quiet some of this background down. I think maybe it can go a little bit richer without competing with the intensity of the grapes or the handle. So even though everything is not, super defined or super detailed or whatever, I mean, you could leave the painting in this stage, depends on, how you like your paintings to look. So if you like a looser, look, this might be the place to say, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to stop. I think I got what I wanted. It feels fresh. So it depends on how refined of a look you're going for. Or how fresh, with more alla prima painting, trying to do in one sitting, that's part of the beauty of that, is that sort of freshness. Changed the value too much there. Now all the paint is really starting to set up nicely so I could really move it around and manipulate it and, you know, get things a little bit more refined if I wanted to. Which in my case I usually do, you know, unless it's to some degree, I mean, not the hyper realism, whatever, everybody's got all their labels for things, but nowadays, but, you know, some days I might be in the mood, one day I might be in the mood to keep it more fresh and juicy, really juicy, and other days, you know, I might be trying to do something else, you know, go for a more refined, you know, polished look. So for me, it's not so much a matter, you know, of, well, can or can't I do that? You know, I feel like I can do both. It's just a matter of what was the point of that painting that day, or what was it that I was trying to achieve? So you should be able to set in your mind your intention beforehand of, you know, this is what I want to have happen. And that's my intention, and that's my focus. Then that's, you know, what should happen. But if you are not staying focused, you'll get lost, and your painting will just kind of end up however, you know, it ends up. Okay, so just trying to clean up those shapes. They get real, especially with white, it gets real broken up. Anything, you know, going closer to the background, I might just take some background color here and use that as, you know, reflected light within these shadows, a touch of that as it gets closer to the background, where your start of the shadow is here, where the shadow starts and the light ends. That's where your shadow is perhaps most intense, most dark, most contrast. And I like a little bit of that blue shimmer again, just kind of tapped in, excuse me. Pardon me. Tapped in on the turn there. And how much of that I could do on this orange. Yeah, I think a little bit of that is nice. You know, if it goes too cold and blue on a super hot object, it might get too much attention. So the whole point of it is not to maybe stand out so much. So you have to be the judge of that. Just trust what you're seeing as to whether or not it's getting too much attention or not. So at this stage, I'm really just looking at all of the relationships, the edges. Does everything feel like it's solid? And then right now I'm sort of finessing the flow of the light. You know, do I want the light on that orange to kind of spill out and fall onto the tabletop plane right here? That transition color. Again, I think I'm going to leave that last shadow just real simple and quiet, not a whole lot of reflected light or too atmospheric. I just want the painting to sort of end there. And on reflected lights, you know, you always want to look to see what's casting it, or what's reflecting it, I guess I should say. And, you know, it'll be sort of a combination of the color of the object it's on, as well as the color that's being thrown into it. So if it's, you know, usually if it's a white object reflecting back into something, it will be like a cool bluish color. All right. So you really want to it's hard because you want to think, I would say, think a lot about what kind of painting you want to paint before you actually paint it. And then, whenever you go to paint, you've got to let go and paint, but you also want to make sure that from sort of step to step that you're staying focused and concentrated on what you're doing. There's that little gold band, and it has to transition and go from a darker color, darker and warmer in the shadow, although I think it can have a little more yellow, and then cooler. This is mostly burnt umber and a cadmium, so keeping going with those reflected lights, a little more reflected light in the underplane of this orange, where you look at the shape there. And again, now the paint is set up so nicely. We do have this one little grape sort of here overlapping in front, which I think might be kind of fun to put in. It's a nice little dark, the little highlight. Don't forget the cast shadow. I might make it smaller than what I'm seeing. A little smaller grape than the rest. All right, I think that's kind of nice. Beyond that, like, do I want to maybe have more of a distinction on this cast shadow? That little triangle shape in between there. And, oh yeah, we talked about, I kind of ruined that edge sort of on purpose there to let some light escape, and actually there's a cast shadow. From the bucket's so close to it. That might be kind of fun to try and see how that affects the thing. So cast shadows, are different than form shadows. It's an edge that would otherwise be in light, but something is blocking light from it. And so in that case, it can describe the form, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Like sometimes it just cuts directly across the form. But it can make for an interesting effect. And usually you can use somewhat harder edges on a cast shadow. Maybe go a little darker and inkier on a cast shadow than what you would on a form shadow. Is usually a little more gentle and a little bit more softer edge than the cast shadows. All right. And so it's just so much fun too, like watching it evolve. Trying different things to try to see what you can learn. If I give more color to a shadow, what does that do? If the values come closer together, what does that do? So just, each painting is sort of an experiment in your understanding along the way. And you want to allow yourself the freedom to explore, and I think especially, that's especially important for everybody. It can become somewhat of a challenge if you are, for example, selling paintings or in galleries or whatnot. Sometimes there's somewhat of a feeling of the need to perform at a certain level, and so sometimes that can start feeling a little bit stifling, but it's an important thing, I think, to always fight for. It's, just the need and the craving and the want to always be learning something new, instead of just feeling like you're always repeating the same solutions over and over again. And so just using a little bit more of that, and just having fun with it, just having fun. Just letting the beauty of the paint do what it needs to do, not letting your inhibitions or your even your lack of knowledge or your being unsure about how to do something. If you could just even concentrate, if that's the case, even if you could just concentrate on one brushstroke at a time, and just the beauty of the paint and the color. Just, oh my gosh, can I just make beautiful paint today, or beautiful color? That alone, is enough. That pleasure, I think, is just so important, and it shows, I think, in people's paintings, if they enjoyed themselves or not, if they loved the process. So I'm always trying to encourage people to focus on the process while you're painting. You've kind of planned out the product, so to speak. Whenever you set your setup up, you're sort of thinking about that. What kind of painting do I want to make? And then when you're painting, just kind of letting go and enjoying the process of it. And again, just make sure you take breaks. Keep track of where you are. Okay, yeah. Yeah, this is really a cool, I like this painting a lot, actually. I like this setup a lot, this idea. I just try to put a little more cooler light on the top plane of this cloth. Here, just a little bit more of that white and raw umber. I think there's a little bit of yellow ochre in there, because black is also another thing I think that's difficult. It can go really gray really fast. So, and we'll try to do some more of that, a little bit more of the light on that red. Just some touch of that. Especially here on this lit edge, and then it kind of curves around to a softer bend. It sort of picks back up and catches the light again over here. So fabric, it really just falls on the weight of itself. And so you really have to pay attention and study, which part of the form might be getting more light, and then when does it turn away from the light. It's, almost liquid in that way, that it's not quite as set in stone as some of these other objects. It's very malleable in its structure, so you can kind of, like here, this falls, into more shadow, and here on this bend, and then it comes back out and catches the light in this area. And then just keeping a softer stroke if it's a softer fabric. Satin is a totally different ball game than, say, a velvet or you know, something that's more reflective versus, oops, it's a little much. But wasn't it beautiful? It's such a beautiful stroke and color. Okay. Might just have to do one little highlight on this, the rim of this bucket, and call it quits. I mean on the handle. Just a little handle. Highlights are so important, you know. They just kind of indicate where both the texture of the thing and also where the form turns, so it's important that we do put them in. All right, I hope that you learned a lot from this, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Leave your comments below, and you can also visit, I have a whole video on the materials, so you can also visit that if you would like more in-depth details about the materials that I use. Okay, so happy painting, everyone, and I hope you keep painting with passion and with enjoyment, and lots of fun and pleasure, so that you make beautiful, sincere paintings that are just filled with delight. Okay, and there we have it. I'm gonna sign it down here, just carve into it. And thank you all so much for watching, and again, I hope that it was beneficial to you. Bye-bye.